Hello, everyone. Welcome to History Made Awesome podcast. My name is Eric, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Dan. Say hello to the people, Dan.
Hello to the people, Dan.
Now, before I introduce my next guest, I want to say all episodes of the upcoming podcast and previous podcast episodes will be coming to audio. We'll be an audio version. So if you guys like Spotify or Apple Music, if you guys like that type of stuff, I'll try to do my best to get on those platforms. But yeah. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest for today is Ian Campbell. He is an associate professor of history at UC Davis. Hi, Professor, and welcome to the program.
Hi, Eric. Hi, Dan. Nice to meet you, Dan. Good to see you again, Eric. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Before we begin, why don't you let everyone know, what you, introduce yourself. What do you study? Where do you get degrees, and what classes do you teach at UC Davis?
All right. So I'm currently an associate professor of history at UC Davis. I also chair the PhD program here right now. I did all of my education actually at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. My undergraduate was in history and also Russian language and literature. Did my doctorate there. My focus is on the history of the Russian Empire as an empire. That is to say, not a Russocentric history of it, but as this kind of multi-ethnic space. So my first book is called Knowledge and the Ends of Empire, Kazakh Intermediaries and Russian Rule on the Steppe, 1731 to 1917. It's available for purchase from Cornell University Press. They would want me to say that. A Russian translation is now also available. I picked a really good year to be selling books in Russia. So that book is more or less about how Kazakhs educated in the imperial Russian system, so relatively elite Kazakhs, Russian-speaking Kazakhs, the ways in which they managed to find a space for themselves to define what empire was, to influence policy, and the way that that space closed by the early 20th century. So that was a history focused on a very specific part of the empire, the Kazakh steppes. My work now, well, also my work has been quite disrupted by the events we're going to be talking about today. I had a long archival trip, and the next one may not happen for quite some time, but I'm interested now in issues of borderlands violence in a broader imperial perspective. So how did the Russian army operate on different imperial borderlands? What kind of culture of violence did it have? How did they manage to justify violent acts or atrocities that they committed during borderlands warfare? And that's trying to bring, at different moments, campaigns in Poland, in the Caucasus, and in Central Asia into a comparative framework.
And then what classes do you teach so people can know kind of like what you do at UC Davis?
Oh, goodness, a lot. So I wear a couple of hats at UC Davis. I balance my time pretty well between teaching Europe in the long 19th century and teaching specifically Russia-centric classes. So, for example, I teach Western Civ, as everyone who does European history here does. I teach a class on the long 19th century in Europe through more of a military perspective. So with total war as being an important component of the 19th century. I team teach a very popular class on the history of World War I. But also in Russian history, I teach the entire kind of sweep of Russian history from Kiev Rus all the way to the present, although most commonly I'm teaching from Peter the Great to the present. And I offer a variety of seminars in Russian history as well. Most recently, a history of science in the Soviet Union and a history of Islam and Muslim people in the Russian Empire and Soviet Union. I dabble a bit in world history. I teach our graduate global history pro seminar sometimes, and I teach an introductory history class, kind of an introduction to the discipline of history. That is essentially a global history class introducing different historical methodologies. This focuses, when I teach it, on mood-altering substances and their relationship to modernity. So coffee houses and, kind of the new cultural history, opium, drinking tea to work at a factory longer, all that good stuff.
Yeah. And speaking of classes, so for people who don't know, I actually took one of your classes, and that's kind of how we met at UC Davis. So I took your class I actually found the syllabus actually, which I have not been able to find for other classes at UC Davis. So the class was 138B, Russia.
Relevant right now.
Yeah, Russia in the Age of Reform Revolution. Do you still teach that class by any chance?
I do. I will be teaching it again this coming fall, when I expect we will have, Russian Empire is a topic of great interest right now. So I expect it will be a packed house.
Yeah.
And
So
I'm taking it as an invitation to play up the kind of imperial component even more than I would tend to. Normally.
yeah. Yeah. And so yeah, it was a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9 a.m. to 9:50. So bright and early in the morning.
Mhm.
Uh so 2017, yep. And just two things that kind of like I remember from that class. One of them being it was during it was well, Thanksgiving of course is in fall semester. And I remember that there's like 2 days, I think, that 2 to 1 days of class. And
Mhm.
basically you said that like if anyone comes in on those days, that you would wear like I think it was I don't know what the official word is like a Russian suit, but basically wear like a tracksuit that
Yeah.
made you look like I wish I have the picture, but it's on my old phone. But it
Yeah.
was brilliant. That was super brilliant. Do you still do that by any chance, or you just
I
that was one time
usually
thing?
I usually do. I'll do the tracksuit. So I now do an extra credit assignment where, you can do extra credit in two different ways. You can either like watch a movie and write a response, or you can create a meme, your own meme about Russian history and share it on Canvas. And my rule is if more than half of students will participate in that, then I will wear the tracksuit on the last day. Uh, the past 2 years of quarantine have made fitting into the tracksuit maybe a little bit of a trickier proposition. I can still get in there. Unfortunately, the vodka connecting people shirt that goes with it is that doesn't fit right now.
And then the second thing, this is actually I think it's the only time in my class that I actually had to do like a oral exam. So in the syllabus, you say that only 50% will be based on a Russian style final oral exam, which I thought was pretty interesting. But like the funny interesting, I don't know if you knew this, but I think I was on teetering like on A B precipice, and so that was a very important like assignment. And so I did well, but I was kind of nervous because like during that time I was on track to get my first ever all straight A's
Oh
in
yeah.
college. So like I was like, yo, like I've been working my ass off for this. I hope that hope this thing works out. But yeah, so yeah, it was pretty interesting.
I,
Is you still do those kind of oral exams?
yeah, I do, and I remember you did great. You were really clutch. Hashtag built different. Um, I mean, so I still do them. I'm starting to get a little worried about how it scales. Like we might have 85 people in 138B this fall, and I do 15-minute exams, but the last time I did it, I had 70. I mean, obviously this couldn't happen during the pandemic. The last time I did it, I had 70 exams in 3 days, and
Ooh.
and by the end, my brain was pretty squishy. It was, but I do it, and I will keep doing it as long as I can. I like doing them for a few reasons. One, I think that a blue book exam is probably the least relevant way of showing your skills in the real world. Like nobody ever has to do that. But you
Mm.
might want to be able to talk about something intelligently. I like it that way. I would much rather have a conversation with somebody than sit in a room by myself grading blue books. So in part, it's for me. Grading blue books is terrible. You're now in grad school. You know this very well.
Yeah.
I like being able to actually put a bow on the quarter. For those of you who might not know, UC Davis is on quarters, not semesters, so it's 10 weeks. It's a real sprint.
Yeah.
I like to be able to kind of put a bow on the quarter for a student, like actually see them one last time, tell them how they did, try to find something they did well, even if the exam wasn't that strong, and like, give them something to remember. And it's also nice, like, so all of that is like the kind of perspective on why we should do oral exams, right? I
Mm.
also hate grading blue books when someone will just like write in generalities and like I really yeah, you don't really know that, do you? And on a blue book, you just kind of have to take it. But on an oral
Yeah.
exam, I can say expand on that and find out whether that's possible or not. So I think it's a nice thing to do. I think it's memorable for students. And it also helps me to tell who really knows the material and who's kind of BSing their way through it. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and then also congratulations on being the chair. Is it just for this semester, or is it like a thing that's gonna
Um,
happen for a couple of
so I
years?
am, yes, it's kind of a vice chair role. So there's a
Okay.
department chair, and then there's a vice chair who runs undergraduate programs and a vice chair who runs graduate programs. I do the graduate programs, and I'm now at the end of my second year of what's meant to be a 3-year hitch in that role. Um,
That's cool. That's cool. Yeah, that's amazing. So
Thank you.
uh so Dan, before we continue, do you have any other questions or things you want to add, or you're ready to move on?
No, let's do it.
Okay, sounds good. So, like Professor Campbell said, we will be talking about the war in Ukraine. Before we get to that part, I think it'll be best to kind of dig into some of his work. And Professor, I think reading the work you did and the ones you sent us, the articles you sent us, I can see a lot of connections. So we'll talk about that. But first off, before we get into that, why did you choose to become an historian? And what was that your journey like? At the same time, how did you come to study Russian history and specifically its colonial projects in Central Asia? What got you there?
I mean, so it's this long series of accidents, if I'm being honest. So I did not start my undergraduate career intending to. I always liked reading history, but I never, and I took some history classes my freshman year. I never intended to major. I came in as a major in the hard sciences. Well, I was double majoring in chemistry and math, actually. And I did okay at it, but I also, at that level, really hated it. Like I really hated the way the research was. I I wasn't enjoying myself, and I really found that I was getting a little more pleasure out of reading books and talking about them. And so I cast my net around a little bit. And the first semester of my sophomore year, I took a class on a very obscure subject on the recommendation of one of my survey course professors. I took a course on medieval Russian history, a very obscure subject, so like all pre-Petrine. And this class, I should say in part two, like this is the start of my sophomore year. I'm 18, 19 years old. I'm really looking to like find something to do, something to grab onto, right? But this class was amazing. And the thing that I thought was most interesting about it, well, there were a couple of things. One, it was a society that seemed so different from anything that I was aware of. It made me question a lot of my own assumptions. That was a fun exercise intellectually. It's also a field where very little is known reliably. And so there's a lot of opportunities for you to kind of build your own interpretations, to do your own research, over translated sources, of course, at first, because there's so much space for discussion. The teacher was amazing too. Like, I think I give her a lot of credit because I didn't quite know at the time exactly how big a deal this professor was. She didn't carry it that way, but her name is Valerie Kivelson, and she is the leading scholar of this in the Anglophone world. But she built in these opportunities for us to do research, and that was the thing that I really enjoyed. I wrote a paper in this class on something which seems very dry. So I did this research paper on the Muscovite law code of 1649 in this class, and its relationship to autocracy. And like that research experience was everything that I had been looking for and not finding in the sciences. So that was very exciting. Just very generally, on the first day of class, Professor Kivelson told us that, the state of play in early modern and medieval Russian history, the things we know and don't. It's sort of akin to doing US history if people doubted whether or not the Constitution was authentic. And there were real scholarly debates about whether or not the Civil War had happened. So that kind of wide open field. And that really helped me fall in love with historical inquiry. I took Russian language classes. I took more things. Like I just followed that thread that I found. And then I wrote an honors thesis on I also, had kind of a burgeoning interest in empires and how these work. So it kind of led me to think about Russia as an empire. And there was toward the end of my undergrad, there was a real like boomlet in kind of the first archivally based studies of the Russian Empire and Soviet Union after the collapse. Just when you think about the timeline that happens on, that's people who did their dissertation research in the early 90s, wrote their dissertations in the mid to late 90s, and then got them published as books in the early aughts. So those books came out, and that was also very exciting to me, right? Like, here's something I'm interested in. It's totally new. All these books are valuable. And yet, because it's such a new field, there's so much more to do. So I wrote an honors thesis kind of on those topics using just my Russian. I applied to graduate schools, proposing to do a topic on this. I wound up doing another excellent. I wound up focusing specifically on the Kazakh steppe for my first book because I knew I wanted to do a Central Asian language to study imperialism in one place. And I wanted to study Tajik, a Persianate language, kind of the language of high culture in Central Asia prior to the Soviet era. I applied to a program. There was no funding for me to do Tajik, but there was funding to do Kazakh, so I did that.
Okay. Yeah. So it evens out a little bit.
Yeah, I'm adaptable. I'm willing to be paid for stuff, and this was a summer language intensive, 4 hours a day for the whole summer, and it just kind of developed from there.
Yeah. So speaking of which, let's dive into your work a little bit.
Okay.
So I know your most recent work, you're kind of examining the intersection between violence and empire, specifically in the Russian context in Central Asia. One things I was thinking about is when reading the articles you sent us, and I'll tell you guys all of the articles are soon. But I think there's a clear connection between the use of violence and the building of empires, especially in the 19th and 20th century. The question I have is, what makes the Russian experience different and or similar to other imperial projects?
Okay, so I should say generally before I talk about this question that I generally am interested in a broad comparative perspective. I'm interested in patterns. So I think of things frequently in kind of a genus species relationship. So there were, European empires of the 19th century, and Russia clearly belonged to that genus, and the way that they thought about and used violence was part of that genus. This is something people get mixed up a lot when talking about the 19th century. Russia was consciously a European empire. It was not Western. And they rejected very much that association that Europe has to be the West. But it was if we're thinking about a more expansive conception of Europe, Russian elites who think of themselves on the European map, they absolutely consider themselves to be a European empire. So that being said, I have a bit more of a tendency to look for broad similarities and patterns. So what might be different about it, though? One of the things that has struck me as interesting, so race thinking in the Russian Empire is a little bit different than, say, it is in the British Empire, the French, the German, those categories, or U.S. Empire certainly is a little different. But what's interesting to me is that you don't necessarily need racial categories to produce that kind of othering that generates large scale violence. All the ideas about it absolutely can be racialized, right? You can talk about them in racial terms, but they're flexible enough. So just as an example here, you can find Russian officers talking about Poles and Catholics and Jesuits in the early 1860s in very much the same way they talk about Central Asians, Muslims, and Sufis later in the century. It's a similar kind of logic. I have found, at least it seems to me, that the Russian writers I read are generally more invested in telling a story about not being violent, even as they are being violent, which is to say there's more emphasis on acts of mercy. There's more emphasis on kind of compassion, or like the kind of overall benefit that's being provided, what one historian in the Caucasus calls the gift of empire, right? And it does, I'm still struggling to conceptualize why that is the case, but it does seem to be a more prevalent theme. I mean, and then other things that might be more specific to the Russian setting. The Russian army is much more of an old regime army, even up until 1917. That is to say, mass conscription happens relatively late. The officerial corps remains much more heavily aristocratic than other European armies by 1917. And so you do get more of those kind of specifically aristocratic values as being important to how the army operates as elsewhere, both because of the presence of aristocrats and also because even when those ranks open up a little bit, and it is only just a little bit, because even if you can technically get there, like to get de facto, you have to have money and connections to get to those levels, which means you're probably an aristocrat. But even after that, it means, it's either aristocrats or people who really, really, really got to try to be like them, right? So it's this kind of, it's institutionally well and socially well set up to kind of preserve those values and entrench them over time.
Yeah, the one thing I thought was really interesting is that you had a quote, I believe it was in your article, Violent Accretions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you say that while the Russian Empire was a family, not all of its members had equal rights. And I thought it was interesting because I was trying to think about other kind of similar imperial projects. I think probably the most similar might be France, because technically everyone who was in the French Empire was a French citizen technically, but that didn't mean they were all kind of treated the same. I don't know if that connection makes sense, or is there no clear connection there?
It's an interesting comparison. It's a little differently in Russia because citizenship is a really fraught idea in an autocratic state, right? So everybody is a subject of the Tsar. That's the kind of dynastic model of rule. In that sense, there's also a really strong, in a sense, I think a much stronger comparison would say the Habsburg case, right? Where it's all of these different nationalities and their relationship to the Tsar. This is essentially an empire of special deals, right? So it's this great patchwork of kind of peoples who were in regions who were incorporated at different times and sort of were able to make their own bargain about their incorporation, whether by right of conquest or by treaty or whatever. And there is for a long time this kind of dynastic model of rule, and that makes the elite, by the way, relatively capacious, which is so that's why you see Georgians or Baltic Germans, especially Germans, in the kind of elite circles of the Russian Empire, because Russian aristocrats see aristocrats of different ethnicities as equally elite and, in a similar relationship to the Tsar. Now, this can get twisted. Because again, we're all a family, and the Tsar is at the top of it, right? That does not mean that everybody in the family, as I say, has the same relationship. They all made their own kind of deals with them, and those relationships were historically conditioned. The other thing to say is that the 19th century, as we know, is the era of nationalism, right? And nationalism is a really volatile thing for an autocratic state to be playing with, insofar as it implies that sovereignty might be vested in the people rather than the person of the Tsar. So it's potentially useful, but could also, be explosive. But gradually, over the course of the 19th century, tipping point around the middle, you see more and more of Russian elites imperial Russian elites trying instead to mobilize a more of a nation state conception of what it means to be part of the Russian Empire. So that's one that is more easily racialized, and one that makes it easier to say that there are some groups which have less rights, and that Russians or ethnic Russians or Orthodox people require more privileges as the kind of dominant groups in the empire.
Yeah. So speaking of nationalism, I know that's one thing you were kind of thinking about. One, pull up my Google Doc again. So the interesting between this new creation of identities and like especially nationalism, like I'm doing something similar with my own work and kind of its connection with violence. Like one thing I'm interested in is kind of like how violence kind of creates identities, and I know that's something you touch on in your work, nationalizing violence. In the classic empire. And so the question I have, just to give a background to people who don't know this. So when you look at in the Tugay Oblast, which is like in Central Asia.
Yep, northwestern Kazakhstan today.
Yeah. So when you look at pretty much Russia's attempts to nationalize or to Russianize the area, and what you see in that like a most perfect like state that's governed by a perfect like hierarchy in a sense, and also the fact that the area is very culturally dynamic, it's really mixed, and Russia's attempts to really nationalize the spot doesn't really work too well. But it really does change when the 1916 revolt happens, when I think you say when Russia tries to draft its local populace.
Yep.
And so the one thing you say is that when that happens, I'll quote you, you say that these extreme conditions presented a stern test to administrators and ordinary people as they sought to make sense of what was occurring and convert thought into action. At the moment of truth, some distinctions based on loyalty or nationality proved malleable, while others hardened. Violence itself was a tool that flattened and clarified an uncertain and tenuous situation. Could you kind of explain what you kind of mean by this?
Okay, so what I mean to say is, so Turgai Oblast, which is today northwestern Kazakhstan, was a region that, starting from the early 1880s, late 1870s, received a lot of settlers from the Russian Empire, from what we might call European Russia, Russian settlers populating. So the idea is that these people, moving these people around would have a couple of effects. It would make more productive lands, which they believe are being used inefficiently by nomads, Kazakh pastoral nomads. So that will be more efficient use of the productive force of the empire. The idea is also that this is kind of a safety valve for surplus population in areas of European Russia where there's kind of land hunger after the emancipation of the serfs. In some cases, they're just making legal what peasants have already done. Peasants have already pulled up stakes and left and moved here, and you can either legalize them or not. They start deciding to do that. And another idea is that these people should have kind of a long-term cultural influence on the surrounding area. They can Russianize it. They can kind of show people how to farm the land by their example, get them, build more schools, have more trade, that kind of stuff. So there's a Russianizing gesture that is different from Russifying. There's a Russianizing idea here. But it's still a borderland and it's still pretty mixed. And so you have, when there's an attempt to draft Kazakhs into the army in 1916. So, I mean, another thing to note is that, like, there are, in some senses, different rules still for the Russians and the Kazakhs in the region, and attempts to impose administrative uniformity don't go that well. So when they attempt to draft Kazakhs, and there's this revolt, it is in this deeply ethnically mixed region. It's much more integrated with the center of the empire than it was, say, 20, 30 years ago, but it's still ethnically mixed. And there are Tatars around too. Tatars are another Turkic group, largely living in cities. And so you've got a lot of peasants, you've got a lot of Kazakhs, some living in cities, some having sedentarized, some still being nomads. Not all of the Kazakhs have rebelled, some of them have. You've also got Cossacks in the area, so kind of border troops. This is always a fun thing to do in lecture, Cossacks versus Cossacks, right? And you've got Tatars. So it's a very mixed situation. It's very hard to know friend from foe. It is an incompletely nationalized borderland. And this adds to the inherent difficulty of counterinsurgency, right? Which is the other issue. Counterinsurgency is always hard. You don't know who your friends and who your enemies are. And the other piece of context is that this is late 1916, where other wars are at a time when other wars are also happening. Anybody who is at all useful in a war is fighting Germans right now. So they have a really hard task in this ethnically mixed borderland where they're pretty sure that at least all the ethnic Russians are on their side. They don't know which Kazakhs are and aren't. And you have the worst troops imaginable trying to do this. People who were medically unfit to go to fight Germans, or kind of the last line of reserves, that kind of stuff. And they're doing it in absolutely nightmare conditions. It is very, very cold. It is late in the year. And so what they wind up doing is essentially they start seeing Kazakhs as an abstraction rather than kind of like a diverse group where there are some friends and some enemies, right? Instead, particularly as they get further up the chain of command, it just comes up like an abstract problem of fighting the Kazakhs. And even people who might know a little better that, yeah, maybe some people in this group are our friends, they're terrible fighters. So they're not used to fighting. What they have is machine guns and heavy artillery. And those things don't tell the difference between who is in a group, who is a friend, and who is a foe. Like, this is in part. So lumping Kazakhs together into a hostile group, it simplifies the situation for these fighters who are kind of overwhelmed. And it actually, it's actually the only thing they're capable of doing. They wind up it's what's interesting to me is it's not this kind of like organized brutality where there's a plan like being coldly executed. It's more like this terrible improvisation, right? We don't know what's going on. We're not that good at war, actually. But we just got to shoot. Like that's all we can do. Like,
Well, I think I'll just go to my next question. I think it's kind of connected. Because the one thing that I thought was interesting was that there is that aspect of kind of like, wasn't like a planned form of like, we're going to use machine guns and artillery, on these people because this is how we think of them. But I think that kind of one thing that kind of came out of it, right, was that like these new forms of like identities were starting to form by using this type of violence. How, I think in the article you say how, Tartars used to be seen as like people who could not be trusted because of their kind of like their horde kind of past, golden horde past. And the Kazakhs are kind of seen as like they've had this ambiguous type of relationship with Russia. But then once all this conflict starts, you start to see the Tartars be kind of seen as like the good friends to Russians, while the Kazakhs, no matter what their distinction is, they're kind of seen as like the enemy and people that can't be trusted. I thought that was one interesting thing that happened in that spot.
So just because like they mistrust the Tatars, not so much because of the horde, the kind of golden horde past, but because they are thought of basically that they are thought of as the bearers of what they call Islamski fanatism, right? Islamic fanaticism, and that they're making the idea for a while in the 1800s that they're actually making the Kazakhs more hostile to Russian power. But then in 1916, it turns out that the Tatars are understood to be on the side of order.
And also I was wondering, because one thing when it comes to violence is that I think when most people think about violence, they think of just kind of like destruction and nothing, just chaos and nothing else happens. But one thing I'm interested in is that violence does create like things like see new events happen, like either new identities or new kind of nationalism or anything like that. I feel like that's one thing that you kind of get from violence as well, looking at it. So speaking of kind of this use of violence, now we know that when it comes to wars, when it comes to war making, especially in European war and just maybe in war in general, war is hellish in its own right. But I think in your article, violence articulation, and also as well as just to give an example of what that is, that Buck looks at Alexei Kuropkin, I believe. Yeah,
Kuropatkin.
yeah, and his military career. And then also you have your article Bloody Belonging, which examines the siege of the forces of Gyeoktope, I believe,
Yuktepe.
Gyeoktope in 1881, and how the results of that conflict was viewed and by literary sources and scholars. Now, the question I want to have is, was this level of violence different to the kind of violence that had been seen in European wars up to this point? Or are there any parallels to the kind of violence that would be seen in World War II and conflicts into the 20th century?
I mean, so it's a bit different. These are relatively small scale conflicts on the Russian border, on the Russian borderlands. At the same time, you definitely see some cross pollination, I would call it, between Russia's wars in Europe and things which happen in borderlands conflicts as well. So, for example, I have a colleague who argues that some of the violence we see in 1916 in Central Asia has to do with habits that forces picked up on the Caucasian front of World War I, before kind of the transfer back into Central Asia. This is further south. This is in a region called Semyurechye, so Uzbekistan and southeastern Kazakhstan. So there are those parallels there. There are less. So there are differences in that most of what the Russians understand themselves to be doing on borderlands are fighting relatively small or disorganized armies to which the laws of war wouldn't necessarily apply, right? That these are disorganized forces, in addition to being racial others, and so things are more permissible there than they might be elsewhere. On the other hand, certainly in the 19 teens, like some of the ideas about how to classify people, how to, population transfers, things like that. This actually gets out of the side of the scope of my own work a little bit, but it actually has to do something with my first book, right? So the use of kind of what we could call population politics, right? So quantifying large groups of people, trying to understand their essence and, lumping them together, moving them around. That happens in that happens during World War I on the Eastern Front, but the kind of way of thinking has been developing in the Russian army for 30, 40 years prior to, and also in other statistical disciplines in the Russian Empire. I would also say that, in terms of thinking about kind of borderlands wars, that there are a variety of conflicts between Russia and the Ottoman Empire as well, and that becomes an important crucible for thinking about Islam and Muslim people within the Russian Empire and making war against them. Absolutely so.
Yeah, and one things I was kind of thinking about is kind of like the indiscriminate use of violence, especially no matter if it's against civilians or not. I can see a lot of parallels to what would occur, especially in the Second World War. And I think one thing that's interesting is you talk about is that there is kind of a racial component, which kind of like when they're talking about it after the war, especially in Gyeoktope, like it's like it was justified based on the type of enemy that they were fighting. And I think that's something you can definitely see that carries over in World War II. And just kind of connect to that too. I think hasn't there been like a lot of connections between what happens in these kind of borderland conflicts that's kind of picked up by, the kind of metropole to kind of use against their enemies, especially after these conflicts, and put it towards even former what they saw, with World War II have the creation of like, different type of race or different types of people. And it's kind of justified to use those kind of conflicts, one of them being, a classic example would be concentration camps used by the British in South Africa. I think in this case, you definitely see the use of artillery and stuff like that used against everybody. So I think that's one interesting connection that I saw looking at it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would frame it less in terms of like, how do I want to say? It's less in terms of it starts in the colony and it comes back home to the metropole. I think that argument is not quite sophisticated enough. It's more that these are part of a circuit of military thinking, right? A circuit that sometimes even, can manage to endure across different political regimes. So there is, particularly in the sense that some of these, 19th century wars are themselves imperial wars, right? Wars of expansion, right? I think the line between metropole and colony gets rather blurry in that respect, and we need to think of that more. Think of these more as I say, a circuit of thinking about war in this kind of recursive process, rather than just thinking it started in the colony and then it came back to the metropole. I find that a bit simplistic.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not saying you're arguing simplistic. I'm saying that when I encounter that argument, I sometimes find that it's simplistic.
Yeah, that makes sense. I totally understand that. Now it's interesting that we talk about this type of violence, and we can kind of transition to what's going on in Ukraine. We kind of see a type of war fighting in that area that hasn't really been seen since World War II. And hold up. Okay, yeah. So and before we kind of talk about and get to that, now one of the reasons why this kind of war is occurring is not only because Putin believes kind of like the expanding threat of NATO, but also the belief, and I just kind of want to quote him right here. He says, this is taken as address to the Russian nation when he basically declares war. He says that Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for Russia. It is an inalienable part of our own territory, culture, and spiritual space. So I will start with the fact that modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, or to be more precise, by Bolshevik communist Russia. This process started practically right after the 1917 revolution, and Lenin and his associates did it in a way that was extremely harsh on Russia by separating it and severing what is historically Russian land. Nobody asked the millions of people living there what they thought. So there is this kind of, in your work, you kind of talk about the relationship between, the Kazakh steppes and the Russian Empire, especially in the late 19th or 20th century. But also, I think there's also a really interesting historical relation between what was going on with Ukraine and Russia. And I think violence is also part of that as well. But can we kind of talk about kind of is there any truth to what Putin is saying, and kind of what is that historical relationship between Ukraine and Russia, if that makes sense?
Okay, so what Putin is saying, and we can talk about the NATO argument too if you want, which is equally specious. But yeah, this is a very simplistic and specious reading of the kind of imperial relationship, the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, and Ukraine's place in Soviet life. So, I mean, the temptation is to go all the way back to Kiev Rus here, right? I'm not gonna do that here. We'd be here all day. So just to be clear, by and large, the Russian Empire does not link ethnicity and territory, right? So you're not going to find something on a map of the Russian Empire which is called Ukraine. There are regions, there are provinces that have Ukrainian speakers or larger numbers of ethnic Ukrainians. Also, prior to 1917, right, a significant number of ethnic Ukrainians are living outside of the Russian Empire. They're living in the Habsburg Empire, right? They're living in what's today Western Ukraine. There are attempts by the Russian Empire to stamp out Ukrainian nationalism, particularly after 1863, after the revolt in the Western borderlands in 1863, to impose the use of the Russian language and to impose the Russian Orthodoxy in those areas as well. And to the extent that some Ukrainians, have recently been Catholic prior to 1863 or confessed, what's called the Uniate Rite. So that is basically a kind of a blend of Orthodox and Catholic traditions. There are attempts to do that. But Ukraine remains the Ukrainian territory of the Russian Empire remains this heavily multi-ethnic space. And that is particularly the case when we look at the parts of sovereign Ukraine that Russia is currently trying to annex or has annexed in terms of the Donbass and Crimea, right? These are heavily ethnically mixed areas that have Russians, Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars in Crimea, of course, lots of Germans in the Donbass as well. So, and then, 1917 happens. Putin is talking about, Bolshevik nationalities policy in a really confused and confusing way. So the Bolsheviks are nationalists, believe it or not, in a very, very specific kind of way. Basically, they believe that nations exist in an ontological sense, right? The world is organized into nations. And that if we go to organize territory into nations, approach people in their local language, in their native language, try to find cadres who look like them and talk like them, this will be the most effective possible transmission belt of communist ideology, right? Eventually nations might fade away, but we have to build communism to do that. And to build communism, we have to recognize that nations exist. Mm-hmm. It also, I think, matters a lot that this is happening in 1917, 18, 19, like this big Wilsonian moment, right? So when I say the Bolsheviks are a very particular, specific kind of nationalists, they organize territory into nations and they recognize national languages to suit their own purposes. They are not friends of people who express nationalist aspirations or of independent nationalism prior to 1917 or afterwards. They like nationalism that they can control. They are not fans of nationalism they cannot control. I'm eliding some differences between Lenin and Stalin on these points, but that's the gist. So Ukraine exists on the map. In a sense, it is, that Ukraine exists in those lines. It has to do with where the Soviet Union drew up these lines. But there was no concept of there was, some of this was really Russian territory and some of this was really Ukrainian territory beforehand. The Russian Empire didn't organize space. It didn't organize people that way. Putin is imposing a 20th or 21st century idea of nationalism way back onto the 19th century, where, as we know, people were thinking about these in rather different terms, and where there was, as we've discussed, this very dynastic model of thinking about thinking about population and territory. So then the borders of Ukraine change a bit during the 19th century. After World War II, the kind of western regions become part of Ukraine. Crimea, Khrushchev transfers from Russian control to Crimean control, to Ukrainian control in the 1950s. Borders do change. And so the kind of evidence that this Ukraine is an inalienable part of Russia, it has to do in part with this kind of specious idea that these were Russian lands at some point, but also the idea that many people in these areas are ethnically Russian or speak Russian and are therefore still ours in some significant way. But that's also not true. Russian is spoken by a lot of people in the Soviet Union, and it happens more and more in the Soviet Union's existence, especially in urban areas, not because of any great cultural affinity with Russia, but because that's the lingua franca of the Soviet Union. If you want to have any chance of advancing out of your own republic professionally, if you want to be able to interact with people of a different ethnicity, you better know some Russian. So there are a lot of people who wind up speaking Russian at least as a second language, and particularly in urban areas, it's much more common that people speak Russian as their first language, regardless of their ethnicity. And Donbass in particular is this heavily industrialized, heavily Sovietized area. And so that's a place where you see a lot of that phenomenon. Russian is the language of the shop floor. It's the language of Soviet institutions. So that's where that comes from. Even it has this mixed population with Russians, Ukrainians, and other people as well. And then, the other thing to consider here is that, regardless of what people's ethnicity is or what language they speak first prior to 1991, prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union. 30 years have passed now, and independent Soviet nations former Soviet nations have also begun developing their own forms of civic identity and ethnic belonging. And I think one of the things that we are seeing in the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that kind of civic belonging, that civic identity as a Ukrainian, regardless of ethnicity, is actually quite salient for a lot of people, is stronger, I think, significantly than Putin either realized or believed. This is not a perfect analogy, but it's an analogy that could maybe work. What Putin is doing in Eastern Ukraine, it's not dissimilar to, say, the government of Mexico invading California, right? To say, hey, look, there are a lot of Spanish speakers in California. There are a lot of people who are ethnically Hispanic in California and who speak Spanish speak Spanish at home or speak Spanish by preference. And these territories were, by the way, once part of Mexico. And so therefore, and so therefore, let's roll the tanks. So it's not a perfect analogy, but I think it's similar, right? In terms of like, some of that might be true on a certain level. There might be people might speak a certain language at home. That doesn't mean that they are necessarily jonesing to change their citizenship or to be invaded, right?
So one thing I was kind of thinking about was that there's kind of like a very similar type of war fighting, right? And like there's this indiscriminate use of kind of like artillery and like rocket fire on civilian populations. And I know in your own work, you kind of looked at kind of how the Russian military kind of used similar tactics on, colonial populations and those types of things. And I was wondering if you kind of see a similar relationship to the type of warfighting that was done there and what was done here. I know recently you just talked about how a lot of it was mainly because of the fact that the military, especially in the Russian empire in the 19th century or early 20th century, was not that good. So they resorted to those types of tactics. But there's also a bit of like not a racial component, but like a different cultural perspective that kind of justified their use in that type of thing. Is there something similar going on there, or is there a bit of a difference?
I would hesitate to draw too many just because a lot of time has passed. And I think that the relevant kind of precedents that the Russian command staff, what's left of it at least, is considering are very different. This has to do, more with, kind of 21st century counterinsurgency, their own experiences, particularly in Chechnya and in Afghanistan as well. I think that has much more to do with it, kind of ideas of military necessity. And of course, that's an argument that you see evoked quite frequently throughout the 19th and 20th centuries as well, that, there was an overriding military necessity to do such and such a thing. I think that's being seen here. In terms of like hatred or kind of racial motivations or anything like that, in Chechnya, of course, that was not a particularly heavy lift. They have to do some very fancy dancing to think about. It goes back to the thing that you said initially, Eric, like, how can you other Ukrainians when also talking about Ukraine as an inalienable part of Russia, right? This is a very difficult line to walk. And that is where I think some of the rhetoric on like denazification that they're claiming is occurring is coming from, right? Mm-hmm. That, these people, that's the kind of othering that is available to them. Like, the idea that there is a substantial Nazi presence in Ukraine is also spurious. Like, there is a small far-right presence in Ukraine and in the Ukrainian officer corps. We shouldn't deny that exists. It's not politically significant. There's also, by the way, a far-right presence in the Russian officerial corps and corps, and I guess corpse is a Freudian slip there because a lot of them are corpses now. But And you would also find this in a lot of armies worldwide, possibly even including the U.S. And then there's also this idea that Ukraine collaborated with Hitler, right? The Banderites, right?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of Eastern European states had groups of Nazi collaborators that did really terrible shit. Pardon my language, but for Nazis, I think it's okay. They did really terrible things, in part because that was the anti-communist force which was available to them, and in part because, let's be honest, these anti-communist groups also shared kind of the anti-Semitism of Nazis. And you see that, by the way, again, not just in Ukraine, but in Lithuania, in Belarus, throughout the Baltics, throughout the Balkans. But I think this is where this kind of denazification rhetoric comes from, because you can't other Ukrainians while having the kind of case for war that you've made make any sense at all. We're going to denazify Ukraine by assassinating its Jewish president, right? Come on.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know if many people know this, but you gave a talk when the war first began in late February. This was a talk put on by the UC Davis Humanities Institute. Mm-hmm. And in this talk, you kind of gave three possibilities for why this war is occurring. You said, the first one was that Putin won a quick bump in popularity, similar to what he got when he invaded Crimea. Second was that Putin was trapped by the self-image that he created as a macho leader of resurgent Russia and had to be taken seriously. And lastly, what you call the most scariest is that Putin actually believes in reclaiming what he calls ancient Russian lands. Since a lot of time has passed since then, with the current events have occurred, have any of these possibilities come true, or has new things arisen in your mind from what you're seeing?
I mean, I think we can pretty comprehensively rule out the first scenario at this point, right? There's nothing quick about this. I do think that, and just also, it's very difficult to assess Russian public opinion about this right now. There do exist polls, but it's very difficult to know the true state of things right now. I still kind of waffle between the second and third scenarios, and I think there's maybe a way in which they fit together, in that he sort of talked himself into the idea that these are ancient Russian lands as a means of kind of justifying what he feels compelled to do. And then, just the other kind of important part of this is, to the extent that he does believe that this is a winnable war for ancient Russian lands. The other point that I wish I would have made more strongly, I think other panelists did make it, is the total hollowing out of Russian political culture in the past few years, which is to say that there's nobody close to him who was able to say to him that, in fact, this is not going to be a quick win. The scenarios that you've constructed are not actually going to occur, even though a lot of them knew it. Some of you may have seen in the days prior to the invasion, to the First War, the days prior to the invasion, this kind of made-for-TV setup in which he's kind of getting all of his close ministers and the chief of general staff on board, and makes them say on camera that they're on board with this. And you can tell Naryshkin, the chief of the general staff, is shaking as he's doing it. Those people knew. But whether it's the second or the third scenario or a combination of them, I haven't typically thought of Putin as that much of an ideologue. It's possible that we're going to have to reassess that, but I'm not accustomed to thinking him in that way. I think of him as it's more that he kind of throws ideology against the wall and sees what sticks. So it's very hard for me to imagine him as being suddenly committed to one specific ideology other than his own personal enrichment. But given that he's kind of waffling between those two scenarios, that those two scenarios may have reinforced one another, there certainly does not appear to be anyone who was able to stop it. And that is a consequence of specific changes that have happened in Russian political and cultural life in the past 5 years, I would say.
Yeah, the one things I was kind of thinking about when the war kind of began was that like I first thought I knew it was good they were going to invade. There was no question of whether or not it was going to happen or not in my mind.
Mhm.
From the one thing for me that I thought was going to be like if Russia invades, I mean they have probably one of the strongest militaries in the world. They should probably roll over Ukraine like in a week or so. But that definitely did not happen at all, and I'm really surprised by kind of the incompetence of the Russian military. At the same time, it's really interesting and kind of reminds me of other similar historical events of kind of the defense that the Ukrainians have kind of put up. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that or like similar thinking that I was had before the war began.
Um, I mean, I was a bit surprised, not having followed like the kind of TikTok of the kind of conflict in the Donbass perhaps as closely as I should have. I was a bit surprised simply because Russia is a very large and Russia is a much more populous and wealthy country than Ukraine is. All things being equal, even though counterinsurgency is hard, you'd rather defend than attack. I thought that would probably tell the tale pretty quickly. But it's also now turns out to be quite explicable that it's not happening. And, I would propose a couple of reasons why that might be. So the one thing I could say kind of in mitigation in respect to the Russian army, and we may find out that this is true later on, it does seem possible to me that we will look back at this as really a new era in light infantry tactics, which is to say, like, you've got a bunch of light infantry zipping around on dirt bikes or similar with shoulder mounted anti-tank launchers. They do not seem to have been prepared to deal with that kind of thing. So and I think that a lot of armies would struggle with that. But they picked the worst possible time to invade with tanks.
Yeah,
They never have managed to establish air superiority. A lot of money on paper has been invested in the Russian army over the past couple of decades, but in fact, most of that money has not actually gone to the provisioning and development of the Russian army. Most of it is in Cyprus, in people's bank accounts. So this is why these tanks that are as they're rolling through the Rasputitsa, the mud season, have not like good tank tires, but the cheapest ones which are available. The difference is in somebody's bank account. Like the corruption at every level of Russian politics, the corruption, which is really the byword and which is so endemic to Putinism, is, I think, critical here. And this accounts for all sorts of things. This accounts for, they were supposed to be building this very sophisticated communication system, except it doesn't freaking work. So they are instead in Ukraine communicating over on cell phones on the Ukrainian cell phone network. So, like, why are Russian generals dying at such a rate? That's part of it. And like, I do think of corruption really being at the root of all of this, right? The Russian army is underperforming in no small part because they've got lousy equipment, and leaders often being promoted not because of their military talents.
Yeah, that's one thing that was really surprising to me. Now, it's interesting about this because just about this entire event, that's kind of there's people who are part of the former Soviet bloc who are concerned about what's going to happen with them in their countries, especially with this war in Ukraine, and just kind of give a bit of a not really personal story, but like something like a little personal connection, I guess. So I have a friend from Finland,
Mhm.
and she's been hearing a lot of stuff about the threat of Russia invading and what that can mean, and like there's a whole bunch of like political rhetoric that's occurring in Finland, like talk of nuclear war and stuff like that. And for her, she's been kind of like really concerned and kind of like freaked out a bit. um do you just kind of going off of that, like, do you think that this is kind of an expansion towards other countries than not just Ukraine, or what do you think that kind of threat is like, if that's a
I
possibility?
mean, there's certainly some saber rattling about this, right? And just this morning, there are some kind of threats made, about the idea, Transnistria is next, right? So that chunk of Moldova, that Transnistria might be next, and Finland and Sweden are certainly concerned, and seeking NATO membership as a result. I think that there's certainly rhetoric about this. I think so. It's difficult. One thing is that there's rhetoric, but there's also the question of, like, literally with what army right now.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
this is pretty well tied down, like, in Ukraine. It's been humiliated. It's going, like, what forces are available to do.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so other than that, I would say that Finland and Sweden are right to be concerned. I think that this will probably wind up driving Finland and Sweden into NATO as well. I can't see Russia actually having an ability to pick the fights it says it wants to pick right now. Transnistria might be one thing, in that that's a relatively small piece of territory. On the other hand, that's getting them even closer to Europe, and I think there may be other consequences for doing so. But otherwise, I get that the Baltics are nervous. There were some nerves about this in Kazakhstan as well. I think that we'll see a lot of rhetoric, but I would be somewhat surprised, just in a practical sense, if we see much in the way of action, because they're running out of bodies without, like, a full mobilization. The sanctions which have happened, it's still going to be a few months before we really see the kind of long-term effects those sanctions have.
mhm,
As it is right now, the sanctions, the Russian economy as a whole has responded stronger than I would have expected. But they are kind of working as, like as strategic bombing might have worked before. Like, if they lose material, which they are, they can't get new because they don't have, say, semiconductors or something like that.
mhm.
So I think the rhetoric will continue, and I think that this will produce, probably a kind of realignment, in Russia's immediate neighborhood, which is to say, in addition to Finland and Sweden seeking NATO membership, that you may see some, like Kazakhstan, for example, getting closer to China instead of Russia, that sort of thing. But I think in terms of actual outcomes, I would be surprised if there's all that much, just as a practical matter.
Okay, so you kind of talked about, kind of in your own, like, basically that you're having the problems with the kind of there's two things, right? There's a bit of a problem that you're having with trying to get into archives, especially what's going on in the war of Ukraine. But I was wondering whether or not kind of your perception of Russian history has changed. And kind of the way I kind of view this is that E.H. Carr, wrote in his book, What is History? That you cannot separate the historian from being a human being. And that, like all human beings, they're raised in a specific society and are unconscious or conscious spokesmen of said society. At the same time, they see what is called the regression of history unfold in front of them. So in this mind, he believes that great history is written precisely when the historian's vision of the past is illuminated by insights into the problems of the present. So from this perspective, and he also says that his historian is essentially a product of history. So from this kind of perspective, do you agree with this? And if so, has your kind of perspective of Russian history changed, or history in general changed, with the current events in Ukraine?
I mean, I would say that certainly my understanding of Putin and United Russia and Putinism, that has to change. So my understanding of Putin and Putinism, that has to change. I don't know to what extent yet, and in what direction it will take. But certainly, I have certainly kind of understood him as this kind of highly pragmatic person, and that there's very little which is pragmatic about this, as far as I can tell. And my understanding of the relationship between Putin and Russian society also probably needs to be revised somewhat in terms of where and for what reasons he gets support. I had actually read some political science research right prior to the invasion that I think more or less primed me to think in this sort of new way, which is that Putin's core support ultimately comes from people who score highly on a sociological measure called agreeability, right? Kind of just going along with stuff. And in an environment where media is tightly controlled, that means that people are likely to believe kind of narrative. The people like that are most likely to believe the kinds of narratives that they are told. I do suspect that we probably, and I in particular, have not yet fully understood like what the last few years of what exactly the Soviet legacy, the Soviet inheritance was, particularly outside of major cities, and what the 90s in Russia meant to people outside of those. But I do also like, I've seen some arguments made that essentially, we've all gotten Russia wrong, that there actually, maybe was, after all, this kinds of Russian Zondervik vis-a-vis Ukraine and vis-a-vis kind of these wars of conquest. And I think it is very important to separate. I think it's important not to be making that argument. I don't think that there's good evidence for it. And I think it is very important to make a distinction between maybe we got Putinism wrong and like, we misunderstood how society was structured in a way that was able to pull people along in its wake. But I think there's a way to make that argument without claiming that Russia, that we got Russia wrong and that Russia was always going to be this. I don't think that that is correct. I don't want to go that far. And I think it's not true either.
So Dan, before we get to the last point, what was the question you want to ask Professor Campbell or comment?
So not many questions, a whole lot of comments, and I wasn't here for that part of the conversation. I had technical difficulties, so I don't know if they got addressed. So first, 100% agree that Finland and the Scandinavian regions are being forced to essentially consider joining the EU due to this Russian aggression and the saber rattling and whatnot. And that's exactly what it is. It is saber rattling. It's not anything substantive, while the majority of the forces are tied up, essentially just getting slaughtered due to, again, the corruptionism set up by Putinism. I agree that his ideology is just that empowering Putin, and you can see this by his work as a former KGB agent, where there's a very famous video of him posing as an East German citizen shaking Reagan's hand when he came to visit the country. Where before he was a super staunch pro-communist perfect citizen, now he is a pro businessman, quote unquote, pro hardcore religious right wing Christian fascist. Those are supposedly opposite ends of the spectrum. I don't think he believes either of these ideas. It's just what fits his agenda best. Back further, how he thought the war would go in Ukraine. We were discussing that. Discussing the notions of how they could have thought it would go down, and agree there is a lot of yes men in his administration. It could also been just misallocations due to they thought it would go down very similar to how the war with Georgia went down. Also set up in similar pretenses. Georgia wanted to join join NATO. Georgia also had lands that were formerly Russian and formerly Soviet Union. Also had breakaway republics involved, although theirs were, not to say more legitimate, but there was more civil unrest involved in them.
Like there actually was.
Yes, yes.
There actually did exist like advocates for
Yes.
Ossetian here, like in a way that really there isn't in the Donbass.
100%. Yes.
Um,
I'm sorry, how do you say that second one? I've had a real hard time saying.
which one?
Not
Donetsk.
Donbass, the other one.
Lugansk.
The two. What's that?
So there's Donetsk and there's Luhansk.
Thank you. I've been trying to say that second one for a while. I read it and I go, I can't.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you that it's really a lot of when it comes to Finland and Sweden, a lot of rhetoric, not a lot of things to back it up, and then similar conflicts to what's happened before. So Dan, why don't you? So let's kind of. Oh, actually, though, what? So if you can give a prediction, supposedly historians can predict the near future. What do you think will happen, Professor? What's in your opinion? What do you think is on the cards for Ukraine? Just finish this topic off.
I was actually talking. I did a presentation for the UC Davis History Club last week, and what I was saying is precisely that right now I'm at a point of maximum uncertainty about how this is going to end. Now, insofar as we would look for like some sort of negotiated settlement, right, based on what's happened on the battlefield. But on the other hand, like right now, like I cannot imagine what kind of settlement would be acceptable to either side of this. Which is to say, I cannot imagine Zelensky's domestic legitimacy surviving any kind of territory remaining in Russian hands after this. That might have been possible at one point, but I think that after Mariupol, after Irpin, after Bucha, like I think that after the kind of atrocities that are known, I think that it would be very difficult for him to accept any kind of climb down. On the other hand, I mean, there's a possible scenario in which like Putin finds some kind of way to declare some kind of victory. But most of those ways would involve things which are unacceptable to the Ukrainians. On the other hand, Russia has not fully mobilized because because this is technically still a special operation, but doing a full mobilization would raise a different set of political problems for him. I mean, what it seems to me right now is that even this kind of smaller operation the Russians are undertaking now in eastern Ukraine is not going well for the Russians at all, based on the kind of updates in the past couple of days. All these little salients are getting cut off, but I mean, it's difficult to know like what sort of it's not out of the picture that there would be some kind of escalation. I don't think that escalation is terribly likely, but it's not out of the question that some kind of larger scale bombing campaign would be possible. But on the other hand, again, this would tend to defeat the purpose of actually claiming this territory, right? It's just So this is a roundabout way of saying that I really don't know, because the kind of negotiated settlements that would be on the table would be politically toxic for either Putin or Zelensky.
I totally agree. There is a bit of it's gonna be interesting to see what happens, definitely. So I think just to kind of before we get to our Q&A session, let's kind of go back, just kind of like talk about the life of an historian a bit. I know you've lived that life for a decent amount of time, Professor. So Dan, why don't you read kind of the last question for us?
And before we end, I think it would be best to talk about some of the ways that people can be better students of history. Is there any skill or way of thinking that they should concentrate on?
So the main superpower that I would advise for anybody who wants to be a historian is to actually read the old books that people cite. So like this happens. There are a lot of books that people talk about, but they don't actually read Marx, actually read Foucault, actually read Making of the English Working Class. Like, get in there and like form your own opinions about them and try to understand them on your own terms rather than trying to understand them from somebody else's footnotes or like the meta conversation in seminar. You can't do this with every book. We all are human beings, but that is a superpower. Like when you actually know what it says in, I don't know, Capital or something like that, when people are talking about it, it tends to make a difference. I mean, other than that, like, don't miss opportunities to spend as much time as you can in primary documents is my other great advice. Like, I really favor an anthropological approach to history, which is say, I don't do short archive trips really. I love to really immerse myself in stuff, like kind of get a kind of broader picture of what the time and the place were. And also like love archives, go to archives or libraries like whenever you can. Even a couple of days can give you something interesting. But yeah, just that idea of really trying to immerse yourself and actually, I mean, like the short version of the advice is so dumb. It's read more. Like that's about read more, read things that other people are acting like they read, read outside your field when you can. Read novels, read things that give you a sense of how to tell story and how to write instead of just reading nonfiction all the time.
Yeah, that was just really great advice. It definitely, the reading the whole stuff, that's difficult but important, and definitely novels can help you get a sense of how to construct really good historical narratives. But yeah, very, very good stuff. Yeah.
Pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Preston, for giving us the time, and I hope you enjoyed our talk, and hopefully it helps people understand what's going on out in the world.
Really enjoyed it. It's a pleasure to see you again, Eric. Really proud of all you've accomplished. Dan, great to meet you, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Well, hope everyone enjoyed the podcast, and we'll definitely come with a new one very soon. But thank you guys for joining us. Bye.